Alexander was born in the summer of 356 BCE in the Macedonian capital of Pella, a place that sat between the ambitions of the Greek world and the rougher northern frontiers beyond it. His birth was surrounded by stories that later writers loved to tell, because people often feel that extraordinary lives should begin with extraordinary signs. Some ancient accounts say that the temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned on the night he was born, as if the world itself were making room for him. Whether or not that tale is true, it shows how quickly his life became wrapped in legend. He was the son of King Philip II, who was turning Macedon into a disciplined military power, and Olympias, a queen remembered for her forceful personality, religious devotion, and political intelligence. From the beginning, Alexander was born into a household where power, suspicion, and expectation lived side by side. As a child, Alexander grew up in a royal court that was not especially quiet or settled. Macedonian kings did not live behind the kind of distant ceremonial walls that later monarchs might know. They dined with companions, listened to advisors, watched horses being trained, and heard plans for war discussed in everyday conversation. This meant that the young prince would have absorbed statecraft almost as a form of background noise. Ancient writers often describe him as quick, intense, and restless, the sort of boy who did not seem designed for an ordinary life. One famous story tells of him taming the horse Bucephalus as a child, noticing that the animal was afraid of its own shadow and turning it toward the sun. The exact details may be uncertain, but the story captures something that seems consistent across later accounts. Alexander was admired for seeing what others missed, and for acting with a kind of alert, inward confidence. His education was shaped by one of the most famous teachers in history, the philosopher Aristotle. Philip invited Aristotle to teach Alexander and a group of noble boys at Mieza, a quiet setting with gardens and shaded paths, far from the noise of court politics. There, the prince learned literature, ethics, rhetoric, medicine, and natural philosophy, along with the stories of Homer that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The Iliad, especially, became a kind of companion text for Alexander. He reportedly kept a copy under his pillow, or at least treasured it so deeply that later tradition imagined such a habit. In those lessons, he would have encountered heroes who sought glory, but also the tragic cost of glory. Aristotle's influence is difficult to measure exactly, and the surviving sources often turn it into a neat friendship between philosopher and conqueror. In reality, their relationship was probably more complicated. Still, it is hard to imagine Alexander without the intellectual horizon that this education gave him, a horizon wide enough to make Asia feel knowable, and conquest feel like something more than mere violence. Even before he became king, Alexander showed signs of being unusually involved in public life. While Philip was away campaigning, the young prince may have been given responsibilities that were symbolic as much as practical, allowing him to learn the language of rule by doing. He also seems to have developed a strong sense of identity as his father's heir, but not simply in the passive sense of waiting for succession. The relationship between Philip and Alexander could be affectionate, competitive, and tense all at once. Philip was a brilliant military reformer, a man who expanded Macedon through skill, diplomacy, and persistent war. Yet success can make a father seem like both model and obstacle. Ancient sources preserve stories of arguments, pride, and jealousy between them, and although some of these may be exaggerated, they fit the emotional atmosphere of a court where everyone understood that the future of a kingdom depended on one young man's position. The turning point came in 336 BCE, when Philip was assassinated at a royal celebration in Igi. The exact circumstances remain partly obscure, and the ancient accounts contain contradictions, suspicions, and competing motives. What is clear is that the Macedonian court was suddenly thrown into uncertainty, and Alexander moved with striking speed. He was only about 20 years old, yet he acted as though hesitation itself could be fatal. He secured the loyalty of key military figures, addressed the army, and eliminated rivals or possible threats to the succession. In a kingdom built on martial support, the army's acceptance mattered as much as ceremonial inheritance. Alexander's swift consolidation of power suggests that he understood the political temperature of the moment with remarkable clarity. The old king was gone, and if the succession had turned uncertain for even a short time, Macedon might have fractured. Instead, Alexander stepped forward into the vacuum before anyone else could fill it. Once king, he inherited not a peaceful realm but a restless one. Greece had been recently brought under Macedonian influence, and the city-states south of Macedon were not emotionally inclined to be ruled by a northern monarchy. Some viewed Philip's death as an opportunity to recover independence. Alexander responded with force, diplomacy, and speed. He moved to secure the loyalty of the Macedonian army, then turned south to affirm his position among the Greeks. The Corinthian League, which had earlier recognized Macedonian leadership, needed to be kept intact, and it was. His methods were decisive, sometimes severe, but not always simply destructive. He knew that fear, when mixed with clemency, could be more effective than fear alone. Early in his reign, the impression he gave was of a young ruler who understood that kingship was not a static title, but a condition that had to be continuously defended. It is easy to imagine Alexander as someone who was always destined for invasion and empire, but in the beginning his first task was stability. He had to persuade soldiers, allies, and rivals that the state would survive Philip's death without collapsing into civil struggle. He also had to manage the memory of his father, whose achievements overshadowed him in dangerous ways. Philip had created the military machine. Alexander would inherit it, but he still had to prove himself worthy of commanding it. This is one reason his early reign matters so much. It shows that before the great campaigns in Persia, there was a young king learning how to occupy the center of a system that was larger than any one man. The glamour of later conquest can make this period seem like a prelude, but it was really a crucial test, one that Alexander passed by combining urgency with control. Soon after securing the throne, Alexander faced rebellion in Greece and beyond. The city of Thebes rose against Macedonian authority, perhaps hoping that the new king would be too young or too busy to respond with full strength. Instead, Alexander acted with terrifying clarity. He besieged the city and after its capture allowed it to be destroyed. The punishment was harsh, and even ancient historians seem to have felt the weight of it. Thebes was not just defeated, it was made into an example. Yet Alexander's decision was not only about revenge or rage, it was also a political message sent across the Greek world. The succession had happened, the Macedonian order remained intact, and resistance would be expensive. The destruction of Thebes cast a long shadow over the beginning of his career, showing that brilliance and cruelty were already closely intertwined in his rule. And yet, for all the force of these early actions, Alexander was not merely a man of war from the start. He was also a ruler working within inherited systems of meaning, tradition, and self-image. He understood how stories could shape reality. His public identity drew on heroic models, divine ancestry, and the language of Greek culture, even as he ruled a Macedonian kingdom distinct from the city-states around it. He traced lines of connection to Achilles, to Heracles, and to the heroic age that Homer had made immortal. This was not just vanity. In the ancient world, ancestry and analogy mattered. A king who could place himself inside a recognized pattern of greatness might seem more legitimate, more inevitable, more than simply a political accident. Alexander's early years were already filled with this sense of being both a person and a symbol, a young man carrying a realm of expectation that was almost too heavy to name directly. His personality, as reconstructed from ancient sources, appears to have been a blend of charm, impatience, ambition, and intense concentration. He could be generous, even affectionate, and then suddenly severe. He seems to have admired courage in others, especially when it came with loyalty and self-command. He also appears to have had a strong emotional response to honor, reputation, and the thought of being judged against impossible standards. Some scholars caution that the surviving portraits of Alexander are filtered through later admiration and criticism, and that the historical man is harder to see than the legend. That is true. Still, across the uncertainty, a few outlines remain. He emerges as someone who believed that life was brief, that fame was fragile, and that greatness had to be seized rather than patiently awaited. Even as a young king, he seems to have lived with a sense of urgency that made his world feel tightly wound, like a bow drawn back before release. By the time his early consolidation was complete, Alexander stood at the threshold of the wider Mediterranean world. Macedonia was secure enough for action, but not secure enough to allow delay. The army was ready, the political stage had been cleared, and the old obligations of his father's ambitions now belonged to him. The years before the Persian campaign were not merely preparatory, they were the period in which Alexander learned what kind of ruler he would be. He had been born into legend, educated in philosophy, tested by succession, and hardened by rebellion. And in all of this there was still the quiet fact of his youth, a youth that made his confidence more remarkable and his risks more difficult to measure. The one small detail that helps bring Alexander closer to the human world is his childhood education, which was shaped by one of the most famous teachers in history. As a young prince in Macedon, he was taught by Aristotle, whose influence would leave traces not only in Alexander's interests, but in the broader intellectual atmosphere of the court. The exact content of their lessons is impossible to know in full, and later writers often imagined the relationship with more drama than the evidence supports, yet it is easy to picture the quiet intensity of that education. A royal boy in a mountain kingdom, listening to ideas about ethics, politics, medicine, and nature, must have felt the world widening around him. Macedon itself was a frontier kingdom to many Greeks, less polished than Athens, more rugged, more militarized, and perhaps less interested in elegant theory than in survival and power. But under Philip II, and through the tutoring of Aristotle, Alexander was exposed to a culture that valued both action and knowledge. He is often remembered as a conqueror, but in his youth he was also a student, and that balance between the sword and the scroll would remain part of his legend. It is tempting to imagine him walking in the soft light of dawn, repeating Homer, while the scent of earth and olive wood drifted through the palace grounds. That early education may help explain why Alexander so often carried Homer with him in later life, especially the Iliad, which seems to have become almost a companion for him. Ancient sources say he treasured the poem and admired Achilles in particular, seeing in the heroic youth of Troy an ideal of glory, courage, and tragic greatness. Of course, the historical Alexander was not simply a character from epic poetry, and we should be careful not to let the myth erase the man, but the association is powerful. The world of the Iliad offered a language of honor that could fit the ambitions of a Macedonian king looking eastward. It also gave Alexander a framework for thinking about fame, mortality, and the fleeting nature of life. The book or scroll would have been handled often, perhaps worn by use, perhaps kept close during long campaigns. In the stillness of camp at night, with weapons stacked and horses settled, a ruler might read of battles older than his own and feel himself entering a timeless tradition. Whether or not the famous anecdotes are exactly true, they reflect how later generations understood him, as a man who wanted not merely to win, but to be remembered in the style of heroes. Before the Great Eastern Campaign, Alexander also spent time consolidating his position in Greece, where Macedonia's authority was not always welcomed. After Philip's death, there were immediate doubts about whether the young king could hold together the alliance his father had built through diplomacy, threats, and military strength. Cities watched carefully, weighing rebellion and submission, while Alexander moved quickly to secure loyalty. The speed of his response is one of the most striking things about his early reign. He did not have the luxury of delay. News traveled by riders, rumor by merchants and envoys, and every decision seemed to echo across the Greek world. He had to appear both legitimate and formidable, a son worthy of Philip and a new ruler capable of surpassing him. Some cities accepted him with relief, others with calculation, and some with fear. This was not a peaceful inheritance. It was a kingdom of pressures, alliances, and memories. The air must have felt tense in council halls and city gates alike, as if everyone understood that a new age had arrived, but no one yet knew its shape. That need for authority eventually carried Alexander south to Greece, where he worked to reaffirm his leadership within the League of Corinth. The League itself was a fragile arrangement, a kind of political framework designed to bind Greek states together under Macedonian dominance for a common war against Persia. In theory, it spoke the language of unity. In practice, it rested on power. Alexander's appearance in the Greek mainland would have been watched with a mixture of resentment and necessity, depending on the city and the person looking on. He had to project confidence, but he also had to navigate old rivalries and civic pride. Ancient societies paid close attention to gestures of honor, public speeches, and ceremonial recognition, and Alexander understood this well. He knew how to move through a hall and how to let silence work for him. The success of his early political maneuvering was not only military, it was theatrical, administrative, and psychological. He was young, but he was inheriting a complicated stage, and he had to learn quickly how to stand at its center without appearing to strain. Among the earliest and most dramatic moments of his reign was the destruction of Thebes, an event that shocked much of Greece. The exact circumstances were bound up with revolt and rumor, and ancient writers often described the episode with a grim sort of awe. The city had challenged Macedonian authority, and Alexander responded with overwhelming force. The punishment was severe, and the memory of it lingered for generations. To us, the event can seem like a brutal assertion of power, and it was. But to many of Alexander's contemporaries, it also sent an unmistakable message. The new king would not be tested lightly. Thebes, once a leading Greek power, became a symbol of what resistance could cost. Streets that had once carried processions and civic life were transformed by violence and fear. It is difficult to read of such destruction without pausing, and the silence around the event seems almost to deepen it. Yet from Alexander's perspective, the choice was part of the harsh logic of kingship in an unstable world. Reputation could be made or broken very quickly, and he chose to make his reputation terrifying. After Greece was secured, Alexander turned toward Asia, and the scale of his ambition became visible at once. The crossing into Asia Minor was more than a military movement, it was a symbolic threshold. A European king was carrying war into the lands of the Persian Empire, one of the most powerful states on earth. The logistics alone were immense. Soldiers, horses, supplies, and equipment had to move over land and water, through changing weather and uncertain terrain. Every river crossing mattered, every port mattered. The beginning of that campaign would have felt at once exhilarating and precarious, as if a door had been opened and no one could yet see its end. Alexander's army was not enormous by modern standards, but it was disciplined, experienced, and led with unusual energy. He brought with him not only Macedonian troops, but allies and specialists, all of them entering a world of different languages, traditions, and landscapes. The sea air, the dust of roads, the smell of leather and metal, the constant noise of march and camp, all of it would have accompanied the start of this vast undertaking. One of the first major clashes in Asia was the Battle of the Granicus, a confrontation that revealed both Alexander's daring and the danger of his method. Ancient accounts differ in detail, as they often do, but they agree that the battle was fierce and that the river itself played a significant role. Water, mud, and the confusion of movement created a difficult battlefield. Alexander is said to have led from the front, as he often did, placing himself in immediate risk. Such behavior could inspire loyalty, but it also bordered on recklessness. His survival in these moments was not guaranteed, and the possibility of sudden death was never far away. In the press of horses and weapons, command could become almost a bodily performance, a matter of presence as much as planning. The victory at Granicus opened the way deeper into Persian territory and signaled that the campaign was not merely a raid or a border war. It was something larger, more sustained, and far more consequential. The river receded behind him, but the momentum of conquest had already taken hold. As Alexander moved through Asia Minor, one of the recurring features of his campaign was the treatment of cities that opened their gates and those that resisted. In some places, he presented himself as a liberator from Persian rule, allowing local customs to continue and showing respect for established traditions. In others, resistance brought punishment. This pattern made his rule flexible, but also unpredictable. It was a practical strategy, yet it also helped construct his image as a conqueror who could both destroy and protect. The ancient world was intensely local, and loyalty often depended on how a city believed it would be treated. Alexander's approach could be surprisingly adaptive. He understood that empire was not only won in battle, it was also negotiated in streets, temples, marketplaces, and councils. The stone walls of a city might remain the same, but the meaning of those walls could change overnight. One day the gates were closed in fear, and the next they were opened in ritual welcome, with incense, banners, and formal declarations under a bright, indifferent sky. Then came one of the most famous episodes in the story of Alexander, though it is one surrounded by legend, the Gordian knot. According to tradition, a difficult knot bound a wagon or yoke in the city of Gordium, and prophecy claimed that whoever could untie it would rule Asia. Alexander is said to have examined it, hesitated, and then solved the problem in a bold and unconventional way, perhaps by cutting it. The exact truth is uncertain, and ancient authors may have embroidered the tale to suit his image, but the story endured because it fit him so well. He was the kind of ruler who preferred decisive action to patient symbolism. The knot became a metaphor, not just for cleverness, but for a certain style of power, direct, impatient, and unconcerned with polite method when a quicker answer was available. Whether he cut the knot or simply loosened, it is less important than what the story became. In the years after Alexander crossed into Asia, one of the most practical truths about his rise was that it depended on movement. He rarely stayed still for long. He marched, inspected, negotiated, fought, and marched again, and that constant motion made him seem almost more like a force of weather than a king. Yet behind the image of unstoppable advance was a ruler who also understood something quieter and more human. He needed people to hold a newly conquered world together while he moved on to the next horizon. So he often left trusted men in place, sometimes Macedonian companions, sometimes local officials who had chosen to cooperate, and sometimes a careful blend of both. This was not always elegant policy, and it did not always work, but it reveals how Alexander's empire was not built as a perfectly planned machine. It was assembled under pressure, in dust and heat, with decisions made by lamplight after long days of campaigning. The people who governed for him had to collect taxes, keep roads open, and manage the uneasy balance between conquerors and the conquered. In some regions, the old Persian structures remained useful, at least for a time, because they already knew how to move messages, supplies, and authority across great distances. Alexander's genius, if one wants to call it that, may have been less about inventing a new administrative world and more about recognizing which parts of the old one could still be made to serve him. That practical side of rule can be seen especially clearly in the way he treated certain cities and local elites. Rather than erase every trace of the lands he entered, he often preserved existing centers of power when it suited him. A city with working granaries, a functioning harbor, a loyal aristocracy, or simply a population too large to intimidate into destruction could be more valuable intact than in ruins. This did not make his conquests gentle, far from it, but it does mean that Alexander's empire was often a matter of adaptation rather than simple replacement. In some places, local leaders were kept in office if they showed submission. In others, new foundations were laid to secure routes, store troops, or anchor military colonies. Greek and Macedonian settlers could be placed alongside older populations, creating communities where languages, customs, and loyalties overlapped. The result was not harmony exactly, but a kind of layered political landscape. One can imagine a marketplace where Persian dress, Macedonian helmets, Egyptian priests, and Greek merchants all appear in the same day, each carrying different assumptions about power and belonging. Alexander seems to have understood that a conquered world could not be ruled only by fear. It also had to be made usable, legible, and, at least for a while, familiar enough to function. Of course, this broad and shifting empire rested heavily on the men around him, and few of them were closer than his childhood companion Hephaestion. Ancient writers describe Hephaestion in ways that suggest deep personal trust, and later generations have often debated the exact nature of their bond. What is beyond doubt is that Hephaestion held extraordinary importance in Alexander's life. He was not merely a court favorite or a battlefield ornament. He was a confidant, an officer, and someone entrusted with sensitive responsibilities. When Alexander needed a messenger who could carry delicate authority, or an associate who could stand near him in moments of tension, Hephaestion was often there. Their relationship is one of those places where history grows soft around the edges, because the surviving sources are limited and colored by later interpretation. Some modern readers see romantic intimacy, others emphasize aristocratic friendship formed in youth and hardened by campaign. Either way, the emotional force of the connection seems undeniable. Hephaestion's death later in Alexander's life struck the king with an intensity that shocked those around him. In that grief, we glimpse a more private Alexander, one less concerned with conquest than with loss. The stories of his mourning, whether fully accurate or not, have the quality of a candle seen through dark glass, distorted perhaps but still warm with feeling. The army itself was not a single, unmoving body. It changed as Alexander moved farther from Macedonia, growing more diverse with each campaign. Macedonian infantry remained the backbone, but Persian horsemen, local archers, engineers, and allied contingents became increasingly important. In some sense, Alexander was not only conquering lands, he was also assembling an army that reflected the lands he had conquered. This could make the force more flexible, more adaptable to different terrains, and more capable of operating across deserts, mountains, and river systems. Yet diversity also brought tension. Different soldiers had different expectations about reward, status, and command. Macedonians, who had followed Alexander from the beginning, often expected privilege. New recruits and integrated troops brought their own traditions and military styles. The camp would have been a place of layered sounds: horses stamping in the morning chill, smiths working metal, cooks tending fires, translators moving between languages, messengers arriving with dust in their hair. Such an army required almost constant management. Alexander had to inspire loyalty, settle disputes, and distribute honors in ways that kept the whole structure from loosening. His victories were made possible not only by bold leadership in battle, but by this grueling daily maintenance of a coalition under arms. And yet, even as the army expanded, Alexander remained deeply interested in symbols. He understood that people do not obey force alone for long. They also respond to ceremony, appearance, and carefully staged displays of legitimacy. Persian court customs, with their elaborate rituals and controlled access to the king, seem to have fascinated him, even when they made some of his Macedonian companions uneasy. He adopted certain elements of royal dress and court behavior, though not always consistently, and often in ways that blurred the line between diplomacy and provocation. To some Greeks and Macedonians, This looked like dangerous excess, a king drifting toward the habits of Eastern monarchy. To others, it was a clever attempt to present himself as ruler of both Macedonian and Persian worlds. Perhaps it was both. Alexander's court became a place where authority was performed as much as exercised. Audience was regulated, gifts mattered, greetings mattered, clothing mattered. Even the simple act of approaching the king could carry political meaning. Such details might seem small, but in ancient monarchies they were as significant as troop movements. A sash, a throne, a nod of the head, a space kept between bodies, these were all part of the language of rule. His relationship with the Persian aristocracy was similarly complex. Some nobles were incorporated into his service, trained, promoted, and expected to help bridge the divide between conqueror and conquered. This policy was often uneven and not universally welcomed. There must have been suspicion on all sides. Persian elites might wonder whether they were collaborators, prisoners, or future victims of the next purge. Macedonian officers might resent the very idea of sharing honor with men they had fought against. Alexander seems to have believed that empire could endure only if former enemies were brought into a new order, though the order itself remained centered on him. This was part of a larger pattern in his reign. He wanted to absorb the world rather than simply destroy it. That ambition could produce strange and fragile arrangements. Men who had once opposed him might now ride in his retinue. Local customs could be tolerated if they did not threaten his power. Marriages between Macedonians and Persian noblewomen were encouraged in some contexts, not just as personal unions, but as political gestures. It is easy to imagine the awkwardness of such arrangements, the careful negotiations over kinship and rank, the uncertain future of children born from these unions. History often remembers the grand gesture, but behind it are countless private conversations held in tents, corridors, and courtyards. One of the most famous of those symbolic and political gestures was Alexander's decision to visit the oracle at Siwa in Egypt, where he was said to have been acknowledged in some divine or semi-divine manner. The exact details remain uncertain, as ancient sources disagree and later retellings grew increasingly dramatic. Still, the visit clearly mattered. In the ancient world, oracles were not simply places for mystical entertainment. They were sites where political authority, religious legitimacy, and personal destiny could be linked together in a single vivid moment. Alexander had already been accumulating extraordinary prestige, but the idea that a god had somehow recognized him could magnify that prestige far beyond ordinary kingship. Whether he truly believed the more exalted claims is difficult to know. He may have seen the oracle as one more tool for shaping his image. Or perhaps, like many rulers in antiquity, he moved through a world in which the boundary between divine favor and earthly power was not sharply drawn. To his followers, the journey itself must have seemed haunting. The long approach through desert spaces, the heat shimmering above the sand, the silence broken by caravan sounds, and then the sudden arrival at a sacred place that claimed to know truths hidden from ordinary mortals. Near the same period, Alexander's campaigns also brought him into greater contact with the natural limits of the world he was trying to command. Rivers, deserts, mountain passes, monsoon winds, and unfamiliar climates shaped his movements as much as any enemy did. It is tempting to think of him simply as an aggressive man with a map, but the map was alive with obstacles. Crossing the Hindu Kush, for example, demanded endurance from both soldiers and animals, and the cold of high places could be as dangerous as any spear. Elsewhere, the heat of low plains, the shortages of water, and the difficulty of food supply created daily pressures that did not appear in heroic stories, but defined the experience of marching. Ancient campaigns were often won in the less glamorous intervals between battles, when the army had to eat, rest, repair, and not collapse. Alexander's ability to keep moving through such conditions added to his legend, but it also suggests the immense physical strain behind that. When Alexander crossed into Asia, One of the quiet turning points of his early campaign was the way he handled the Greek cities already there. He did not simply arrive as a foreign conqueror with a sword in hand. He also arrived as the man who claimed to be liberating Greeks from Persian rule, and that idea mattered. In cities along the western coast of Anatolia, there were local loyalties, old resentments, and complicated histories stretching back many generations. Some communities welcomed him, some hesitated, and some had to weigh survival against idealism. Alexander understood that power was not only measured in walls broken or armies defeated, it was also measured in how people were persuaded to open a gate, offer supplies, or switch allegiance. His campaign moved through harbors, marketplaces, and narrow streets where merchants, priests, and officials all watched carefully. The air in those places would have held salt from the sea, smoke from household fires, and the ordinary sounds of life continuing under extraordinary pressure. Even then, Alexander's advance was not just military motion. It was political theatre, carefully staged and constantly adjusted, with every city asking what kind of future he intended to bring. One of the most famous episodes from his early Asian campaign is the encounter with the Gordian knot, though the exact details are hazy, as legendary moments often are. According to tradition, a wagon tied with a complex knot stood in the city of Gordium, and an ancient prophecy claimed that whoever could unravel it would rule Asia. Some versions say Alexander studied it briefly, then solved the problem by cutting through it with his sword. Others suggest he simply removed a fastening pin. Either way, the story was remembered because it suited the image people already had of him, a man who refused to be trapped by convention. Whether the event happened exactly as later writers described it is less important than the meaning attached to it. The tale captures something about the ancient world's taste for omens, symbols, and sudden acts of decisive force. In a dusty Anatolian town, amid wooden carts and weathered shrines, a simple knot became a metaphor for empire itself. The story drifted through later centuries because it was easy to imagine and easy to admire. It suggested that Alexander could turn difficulty into momentum, not by patiently untangling every strand, but by choosing a bold answer that changed the problem entirely. As Alexander moved deeper into Persian territory, the Battle of Issus became one of those moments that ancient historians could not stop returning to. It was not the largest battle he fought, but it was one of the most psychologically important. There, the terrain narrowed between sea and mountains, and the Persian king Darius III found himself in a constricted position that reduced the advantage of his much larger force. The battlefield was chaotic, with dust, shouted orders, and the press of cavalry and infantry compressed into a corridor of danger. Ancient writers emphasized the moment when Darius fled, not because flight was unusual in war, but because it transformed the conflict into a personal victory for Alexander. The Persian royal family, including Darius's mother, wife, and children, were left behind and later treated with notable restraint. That detail mattered almost as much as the victory itself. It allowed Alexander to present himself not as a marauder, but as a king of kings in the making, capable of mercy as well as force. Scholars still debate some aspects of Issus, including troop numbers and exact maneuvers, because the sources are partial and often partisan. Yet even through the uncertainty, the battle remains vivid. The sea nearby, the land squeezed tight, the clash of spears, and the sudden realization that an empire could wobble in a single afternoon. After Issus, one of the most striking episodes in Alexander's long march was the siege of Tyre. The city sat on an island off the coast, protected by walls and by the sea itself, and it was not the kind of place that surrendered easily. Alexander could not simply surround it in the usual way, so he ordered a massive causeway built out toward the island, a remarkable engineering effort that seemed almost to challenge nature. Stone, timber, rubble, and labor were piled into the water while defenders looked on from above, hurling missiles and setting fire to siege equipment. The scene must have been exhausting and unnerving, with workers splashed by waves and exposed to attack, and soldiers watching the horizon for ships or counterattacks. In the ancient world, a siege was often a slow contest of patience rather than a dramatic storming of walls, and Tyre became a lesson in how long Alexander was willing to stay and press his advantage. He did not abandon the city when it proved stubborn. He adapted. He widened the causeway, gathered naval support, and tightened the noose. Eventually Tyre fell, but the victory came at a cost, and later accounts describe severe punishment for the defenders. The episode reveals how Alexander's brilliance and ruthlessness could exist side by side, almost like two faces of the same bright and terrible coin. Not long after, Alexander reached Egypt, where he was received very differently from the cities of the Levant. Many Egyptians viewed Persian rule as burdensome, and Alexander's arrival was welcomed in ways that were political, religious, and practical all at once. He made offerings to local gods and traveled to the oracle at Siwa, a remote oasis temple surrounded by desert silence and deep, shifting sands. The journey itself was difficult, with uncertain routes and the kind of heat that makes every step feel heavier than the last. Ancient accounts say the oracle addressed him in a way that confirmed his divine favor, though exactly what was said is disputed. Later traditions expanded the story and gave it a halo of mystery. What matters is that Alexander emerged from Egypt with enhanced prestige, now associated not only with military success, but with sacred legitimacy. He also founded Alexandria, a city that would become one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. At the time, though, it was still only a planned settlement, traced by a ruler's intention onto the land between sea and river. Egypt offered Alexander a kind of calm before the next storms of war, a place of monumental temples, slow-moving water, and the sense that an empire was beginning to outgrow its original shape. As his conquests expanded, Alexander increasingly relied on the cooperation of local elites, and this was another feature of his rule that deserves attention. He was not content simply to replace Persian officials with Macedonians everywhere. In many regions, he kept existing administrative structures in place or adapted them to his own purposes. This was practical. An empire stretching across mountains, deserts, and river valleys could not be managed by force alone. It needed scribes, tax collectors, translators, city leaders, and men who already understood local customs. So Alexander often appointed governors or retained officials who could keep order while acknowledging his supremacy. To modern eyes, this may seem like routine administration, but in the ancient world it represented a subtle kind of conquest. The outward image of a realm could change, while many of its internal mechanisms continue to function. In palace halls and dusty provincial centers alike, people learned to speak carefully, to send messages in the right language, and to offer loyalty in forms acceptable to the new ruler. Scholars sometimes describe this as a fusion of Macedonian and Persian methods, though the reality was uneven and sometimes improvised. Still, it shows Alexander not just as a battlefield commander, but as a manager of systems, someone who understood that empires rest on paperwork habit and human adaptability as much as on cavalry charges. His eastern advance also brought him into closer contact with the varied religions and cultures of the Persian world, and this encounter seems to have affected the way he presented himself. He did not move through these regions as a simple destroyer of old traditions. He learned to use symbols that meant something different to different audiences. In some settings, he appeared as a successor to Persian kings. In others, he emphasized his Macedonian identity. Elsewhere, especially in Egypt, he adopted the language of divine kingship. This flexibility was one of his strengths, though it also made him difficult to pin down. Ancient authors sometimes praise him for respecting local customs, while modern scholars sometimes wonder how much of that respect was sincere and how much was strategy. The answer may be both. A conqueror who ruled a sprawling, multilingual world had to think in layers. Beneath the ceremonial robes and ritual gestures lay practical governance. Yet to the people who saw him in procession or heard of him through rumor, he could seem almost shape-shifting. One moment he was a Macedonian youth from the north, the next a Persian heir, the next a semi-divine figure welcomed by priests. The diversity of the empire he was building was reflected in his own evolving image, as if each new landscape left a different color on the surface of his legend. The Battle of Gorgamla was perhaps the clearest demonstration of Alexander's tactical brilliance, and it is often treated as the decisive blow against Darius. The Persian army had chosen the ground carefully, flattening and preparing the terrain in hopes of maximizing the use of chariots and large numbers. The scale alone is hard to imagine: broad open land, thousands of men, horses, weapons, banners, and dust rising in layers across the field. Alexander faced forces vastly greater than his own, yet he maneuvered with patience, creating pressure points and drawing the Persians into shifts they could not entirely control. At the critical moment, he led his cavalry toward the center where Darius was positioned, forcing the Persian king once again into retreat. The exact details of the battle are debated because ancient sources vary and often dramatize the sequence, but the outcome is not in doubt. After Gorgamla, the road to the Persian heartlands opened. The battle marked not just a military triumph, but one of the most remarkable things about Alexander's reign is how carefully he understood the power of imagery, even when that power was wrapped in a kind of quiet mystery. Coins minted under his authority, and later in his name, often showed him in a way that blurred the line between man and legend. In some images, he was not simply a king in profile, but a ruler with the features of Heracles, the heroic ancestor of Macedonian royalty. The subtle lion-skin association, the strong jaw, the forward gaze, all helped create a visual language that suggested strength long before a viewer could read a single inscription. In a world where most people would never meet the king in person, these images carried his presence across great distances. They moved through markets, soldier camps, and distant cities, passing from hand to hand in a cool metallic shimmer. And because coinage survives so well, modern historians can still study how Alexander's authority was presented not only as political rule, but as something almost mythic, something that could be held in the palm and trusted to speak for an empire. At the same time, Alexander's campaigns were never only about cities and battles. They were also about the practical problem of feeding an army that sometimes stretched across deserts, mountains, and river systems far from home. It is easy to imagine armies as moving in clean lines on a map, but in reality each advance depended on grain wagons, pack animals, local tribute, river transport, and the exhausting labor of many unnamed people. The Macedonian and allied troops could not simply march endlessly in the heat. They needed bread, water, fodder, and time to rest. Alexander's officers had to think about supply almost constantly, especially in regions where roads were poor or where the land itself changed from fertile lowlands to barren stretches of dust and stone. Historians often note that his speed was part of his genius, yet speed only works when logistics keep pace with it. Behind the dramatic charges and sudden assaults lay a quieter, more patient machinery of provisions, camp arrangements, and measured endurance, all of which made conquest possible in the first place. There is also the fascinating question of language in Alexander's world, because his empire brought together people who spoke many different tongues. Macedonian elites used Greek, but even that Greek existed in local forms and shades of accent, and beyond the Macedonian heartland there were Persian speakers, Egyptian communities, Babylonian scribes, and countless others whose daily speech belonged to older regional traditions. Alexander's court had to function across this diversity, and that meant interpreters, bilingual administrators, and the gradual spread of Greek as a language of record and prestige. Yet this was never a simple replacement of one language by another. In many places, local customs endured, and people continued to think, pray, bargain, and dream in their own words. The empire Alexander built was held together partly by communication and partly by compromise, by the patient work of making orders understood without erasing everything else. It is one reason his rule, though short, became so influential. It helped create a world where cultural exchange could travel as easily as an army, settling like dust over old boundaries and mixing slowly into new forms of life. A more intimate part of Alexander's story appears in the people around him, especially the companions, the circle of aristocratic horsemen and close associates who shared his campaigns. These men were not simply soldiers. They were companions in the old sense of the word, aristocrats bound by loyalty, competition, and the strange intimacy that develops among people who spend months at a time in camp, in saddle, and under pressure. Some were childhood friends, others ambitious nobles, and some became deeply trusted before later falling into suspicion or conflict. Alexander's style of leadership made these relationships especially intense. He could reward loyalty generously, but he could also be demanding, unpredictable, and emotionally direct. In the shadow of the tents and the horses and the sleepless nights before battle, bonds were strengthened and strained at the same time. The Macedonian court was never a still place. It was a living network of personalities, each trying to remain close to a king whose energy could lift them toward glory or leave them uncertain of their standing by morning. Another revealing aspect of Alexander's rule is the way he connected military victory with foundations of cities. Many settlements associated with him, whether directly founded by him or later linked to his memory, were placed with a practical eye for trade routes, rivers, and strategic control. These cities were not merely trophies. They were instruments of order, nodes where soldiers could settle, merchants could pass, and administration could take root. A new city could anchor a road, protect a frontier, or provide a stable point in a region that had recently been shaken by war. Over time, these urban foundations helped spread Greek-style institutions, architecture, and civic identity across vast areas. Some grew into major centers of learning and commerce. Others remained modest outposts, their exact histories partly obscured by the centuries. Still, the pattern matters. Alexander's legacy was not only a trail of battles, but a scatter of urban beginnings, places where dust and stone were turned into a more permanent kind of presence. You can almost imagine the slow rise of walls at dawn, the sound of tools against hard ground, and the first markets forming in newly named streets. There is, too, the matter of Alexander's relationship with the natural world around him, which often appears in the ancient sources in almost cinematic terms. Rivers become barriers, mountains become tests, deserts become scenes of suffering and perseverance. Yet these landscapes were not just dramatic backdrops. They shaped decisions, altered marching routes, and determined how far an army could go before exhaustion set in. Crossing the Hindu Kush, for example, was not simply an impressive achievement. It was a profoundly difficult experience involving altitude, cold, thin air, and long lines of men and animals struggling upward through narrow passes. Likewise, the approach to the Indus required adaptation to unfamiliar climate and terrain. The environment had its own authority, indifferent to royal ambition. Alexander's achievement lay partly in his ability to push through such obstacles, but also in his willingness to keep learning from them. His campaigns became a kind of extended lesson in geography, one written in boots, hooves, sweat, and the shifting sound of wind across difficult ground. The ancient sources also preserve the strange and meaningful role of omens in Alexander's life. Before major actions, people watched for signs in the sky, in animal behavior, in dreams, and in the strange accident of daily events. A sudden storm, an unusual bird, a sacrifice that burned in an unexpected way, all could be interpreted as hints of divine approval or warning. Alexander himself seems to have taken such traditions seriously, or at least understood how powerfully they affected morale. In a society where religion and politics were closely woven together, an omen could steady an army or unsettle a king. It could give language to fear or a sense of destiny to a difficult march. Modern readers may hesitate at such things, but in the ancient world they were part of the mental weather of decision-making. They formed the soft background hum of belief around every campaign. And because the surviving accounts often mix fact with interpretation, we are left listening through layers of story, trying to hear not only what happened, but how people at the time made meaning from it. Alexander's interactions with conquered elites also reveal a great deal about the way empire was negotiated. He did not simply replace one ruling class with another in a clean sweep. In many regions, he retained local administrators, incorporated nobles into his system, or relied on existing structures to keep order. This was especially important in the Persian territories, where a vast imperial bureaucracy had long managed taxes, provinces, and communication. Alexander inherited not just land, but a complex political machine. To govern effectively, he often had to work with the very networks he had defeated. This required a balance of force and accommodation, a willingness to reward cooperation while remaining unmistakably dominant. For some ancient observers, this looked like magnanimity, for others like calculated domination. The truth may contain both. Empire, especially in antiquity, was often less a single hammer blow than a long series of adjustments, bargains, and carefully staged gestures. In the quiet administrative rooms behind the public triumphs, a different kind of history was being made, one of lists, seals, instructions, and the patient continuity of paperwork. One especially human detail in Alexander's story is his interest in learning and intellectual culture. He was famously associated with Aristotle in his youth, and though the exact nature of that education is debated in detail, it is clear that Alexander grew up in a world that valued heroic action alongside knowledge of literature, philosophy, medicine, and the wider Greek intellectual tradition. He is often pictured as a man of swords and dust, yet his age also prized debate, observation, and the collecting of information. During his campaigns, there are traces of curiosity about local customs, animals, plants, and the shape of distant lands. Whether he personally gathered such details or relied on scholars and companions, the campaign itself became a moving archive of discovery. Every region offered something new to see and classify. Even if not all the reports survived accurately, the impulse mattered. Alexander's conquests helped expand the horizon of the Greek-speaking world, turning military expansion into a broader encounter with knowledge. It is one of the reasons later generations imagined him not only as a conqueror, but as a seeker, a man whose ambitions reached beyond territory into understanding itself. As the years of campaigning passed, however, the strain on Alexander and his men became increasingly visible. Victories did not erase fatigue. The farther the army moved from Macedonia, the more the men endured climates, losses, and separations that few could have anticipated at the start. Some had marched with him from youth into. One of the most revealing moments in Alexander's eastern campaigns came not in a grand battle, but in the quiet aftermath of conquest, when he began to fold local customs into the machinery of rule. In the lands he had taken from the Achaemenid Empire, he did not simply arrive as a destroyer and leave as a conqueror. He adopted elements of Persian court practice, including ceremonial dress in certain settings and the ritual of proskyneses, a form of respectful gesture that many Greeks found troubling. To Persian courtiers, these habits may have seemed natural, part of the dignity expected around a king. To Macedonian companions, they could feel unsettling, as if Alexander was drifting away from the plain warrior culture that had raised him. Ancient writers disagree on how far he pushed these changes, and whether he was sincerely trying to unify peoples or simply demanding the posture due a ruler of such immense power. What is clear is that Alexander understood symbolism. He knew that empire was not governed only by armies and roads, but by appearance, habit, and the slow reshaping of what people believed authority should look like. In the warm stillness of a royal audience, with embroidered fabrics, foreign accents, and the faint scent of incense, a new political world was being imagined. As Alexander moved deeper into Asia, he also began to rely on marriage and diplomacy in ways that historians still study with caution. He took several wives, among them Roxana, a noblewoman of Central Asian origin whose marriage to him appears to have been both personal and political. Later, at the famous mass wedding at Susa, he encouraged many of his officers to marry women from Persian noble families. The scene is often presented as a bold attempt to blend Macedonian and Iranian elites into a single ruling class, yet the deeper motive is not fully certain. Some scholars see a sincere vision of cultural fusion, others think Alexander was creating bonds of loyalty, hostages of affection in a sense, woven into family life rather than enforced only by command. The banquet hall at Susa would have been filled with movement and ceremony, with garlands, music, and the careful exchange of vows, all under the gaze of a king who seemed to think in terms larger than a single people or a single homeland. Even so, these marriages did not erase difference. They layered it, like silk over armor, creating a fragile new order that depended on Alexander's own authority to hold it together. Not every bond in Alexander's life was political. Some of the most enduring ancient memories concern the closeness he shared with Hephaestion, his trusted companion from youth. Hephaestion was more than a general or court favorite. He seems to have been the one person around whom Alexander could lower his guard, and ancient sources often describe their relationship in language that suggests exceptional intimacy. The exact nature of that bond remains a matter of debate, as it often does when modern readers try to interpret ancient friendship through modern categories. What matters historically is that Hephaestion occupied a unique place beside the king. He was given major responsibilities, trusted with command, and mourned with extraordinary intensity when he died in Ecbatana. Alexander's grief at Hephaestion's death was overwhelming. He ordered elaborate funeral honors, cut his own hair in mourning, and reportedly permitted or encouraged public displays of sorrow on a massive scale. In the broader rhythm of his life, this loss seems to have opened a deeper solemnity. It reminded everyone around him that even the most radiant empire could be shadowed by private attachment and sudden absence. Beneath the marching boots and imperial proclamations, there was still a man who mourned. After Hephaestion's death, Alexander's behavior appears to have grown more severe, more restless, and in some accounts more reckless. Ancient historians sometimes connect this late period with increasing strain between the king and his men. The long years of campaigning, the heat, the distance from Macedonia, and the endless demands of command had worn everyone down. Soldiers who had once followed him with enthusiasm now faced fatigue, homesickness, and the fear that there would be no end to the road. This tension became especially visible at the Hyphasis River, where Alexander's army finally refused to march farther east. They had crossed deserts, rivers, and mountain ranges beyond any Greek imagination, but beyond that river lay the vast expanse of India, and in their minds, still more unknown worlds. Alexander is said to have withdrawn in anger and frustration when his troops would go no farther, yet even this moment shows his practical limits. A king could be brilliant, forceful, and inspired, but he still depended on the willingness of thousands of men who slept in dust, carried shields, and counted the days home. The silence that followed their refusal must have felt heavy, as if the world itself had become too large to master. The eastern campaigns also brought Alexander into contact with animals, landscapes, and weather conditions that impressed ancient writers as almost mythic. In India especially, the Macedonians encountered elephants, monsoon rains, dense river systems, and terrain that challenged their equipment and endurance. The presence of war elephants was particularly memorable. To soldiers accustomed to horses and infantry formations, These huge creatures must have seemed both terrifying and strangely majestic, like living fortresses moving through the mist. Alexander's army eventually adapted by studying and using some captured elephants, but the process was uneven and uncertain. The campaigns in India reveal how conquest could become a lesson in environmental reality. The land itself resisted easy interpretation. Rivers flooded, supplies ran thin, and unfamiliar methods of warfare disrupted the neat confidence with which earlier victories had been won. In ancient storytelling, India often becomes the edge of the known world, but for Alexander's men it was less a romantic frontier than a place of mud, heat and bodily exhaustion, where strategy had to be bent to weather and geography. One of Alexander's more famous military maneuvers in India took place at the Hydaspes River against King Porus. Ancient accounts describe a battle that combined bold planning with confusion, noise, and the unpredictable force of the river crossing. Alexander allegedly used deception and timing, sending part of his force to cross at a concealed point while Porus watched the main encampment. When the clash finally came, Porus's elephants made the field chaotic, trampling, roaring, and scattering formations. What makes the battle linger in memory is not just the victory, but Alexander's reported treatment of Porus afterward. Rather than destroying him, he is said to have admired his courage and allowed him to keep his kingdom under Macedonian overlordship. Whether every detail is exact is hard to know, since the surviving sources are filtered through later literary traditions. Yet the episode fits a broader pattern in Alexander's rule. He often preferred to absorb worthy opponents rather than annihilate them, turning resistance into a sign of legitimacy. The battlefield, after all, was only one part of rule. Another was the ability to transform a defeated enemy into a useful ally. Back in the western stretches of his empire, Alexander also left behind a growing network of cities, many of them named Alexandria. These settlements were not all identical, and some may have begun as military outposts or administrative centers before becoming proper urban communities. The idea behind them was practical as well as symbolic. Cities anchored territory. They housed garrisons, housed traders, and provided places where Greek and Macedonian influence could settle into daily life. Streets, markets, and temples would have introduced a familiar rhythm to lands far from the Aegean. Yet these cities were not blank copies of Greece. They became meeting points where local traditions and imperial structures mixed in uneven ways. In some places, veterans retired there. In others, merchants, craftsmen, and interpreters shaped the urban soundscape. The repeated name Alexandria itself functioned like a signature, a reminder that the king's footprint was meant to endure in stone and planning long after his army had moved on. Even now, the sheer number of places linked to him by that name suggests how deeply he understood the politics of memory. Alexander's return journey from India became one of the harshest episodes of the whole campaign, especially the crossing through the Gedrosian desert. Ancient authors describe it as a disaster, and perhaps they were not exaggerating. Men and animals struggled through immense heat, scarce water, and blowing sand. Supplies broke down. The march became a test not of speed or aggression, but of endurance and poor luck. Some accounts say Alexander chose this route partly to punish his troops for their earlier refusal to go farther east, while others suggest he may have wished to outdo even the legendary hardships of earlier conquerors. The truth may lie somewhere between strategic necessity and personal pride. Whatever the reason, the desert crossing reveals how thin the line could be between heroic ambition and catastrophe. In the stillness of the desert, where daylight seems to press down with a heavy hand and the horizon offers no relief, grandeur can feel very small. Ancient kings often claimed mastery over lands, but the Gedrosian sands quietly reminded everyone that the earth itself did not obey royal commands. As Alexander's life drew toward its end, he became increasingly involved in plans that suggest he was still imagining vast future campaigns. Ancient sources mention preparations for expeditions into Arabia, alongside reorganizations of the empire that included troop movements, new commands, and administrative adjustments. Whether these plans were fully formed or only partly imagined is difficult to say. He was, after all, a man whose ambitions often seemed to outrun the practical limits of time and body. But the idea of new conquests near the end of his life is consistent with his restless pattern. Even after crossing one horizon, he kept looking toward the next. This forward motion may have been driven by politics, by the need to keep his army engaged, or by a temperament that found rest uncomfortable. To those around him, it must have seemed as though the empire was still unfinished. As Alexander's army moved deeper into the Persian world, the conqueror began to encounter not only palaces and cities, but also the practical limits of power itself. One of the quieter facts about his campaigns is that they were sustained by an extraordinary mobile supply system, because an army of tens of thousands could not simply live off heroism and momentum. Grain had to be gathered, pack animals fed, river crossings managed, and roads or tracks made passable wherever possible. In the heat and dust of Asia, even water became a strategic concern. Alexander's success depended on speed, but speed depended on organization, and organization depended on officers, scribes, foragers, and countless unnamed laborers who followed behind the fighting men. Ancient sources rarely linger on these people, yet they were essential to every march. Without them, the great victories would have dissolved into hunger and exhaustion. So behind the shining image of the king on horseback was a quieter world of carts, sacks, ropes, and calculations, a moving city that had to be fed every day. This practical reality became even more important after the conquest of Persia, when Alexander began to present himself not only as a Macedonian king, but as ruler of a far broader imperial landscape. He adopted some Persian customs, and one of the most discussed is the use of proskyneses, a form of courtly obeisance that involved gestures of respect to the king. Later writers often describe this as a deeply controversial attempt to reshape etiquette, because Macedonian companions expected a relationship based more on equality among aristocrats than on distant ritual. Yet in the Persian setting, ceremonial hierarchy had long been part of royal life, and Alexander appears to have been experimenting with the language of kingship that would make sense across many peoples. Whether he truly intended to demand full divine-style worship remains debated. Some ancient accounts may exaggerate the scandal to dramatize resistance from his companions. Still, the episode reveals something important. Alexander was no longer simply winning battles. He was trying, however imperfectly, to inhabit the symbols of empire, and that required ceremonies as much as swords. The tension between Macedonian habits and Persian traditions also appears in the continued role of the royal companion cavalry, those elite horsemen who surrounded Alexander in battle and at court. They were not merely soldiers, they were the inner circle of power, young nobles whose loyalty and prestige formed part of the king's authority. Their horses were carefully maintained, their armor gleamed in the sun, and their presence in the field created a visible sense of command. Yet this group was also vulnerable to the king's expectations, because closeness to Alexander meant both honor and danger. They rode near the front where missiles could strike, and they shared in the exhausting pace of the campaign. In a world without reliable communication at distance, such companions helped bridge the gap between the king's will and the wider army. They carried orders, set an example, and embodied the trust that held the expedition together. The glitter of their helmets and the clatter of hooves would have been familiar sounds in the dust, a reminder that empire often travels on the backs of highly visible friendship and obligation. Among the many stories surrounding Alexander, one of the most famous is his relationship with Bucephalus, the horse said to have carried him through so many campaigns. By this stage in his career, the horse was more than a mount. It was almost a companion in the classical imagination, an animal whose strength and temperament matched the king's own restless energy. Ancient authors say Bucephalus was already old by the time of the Indian campaign, and that he eventually died after the Battle of the Hydaspes, possibly from wounds, exhaustion, or age. Alexander reportedly founded the city of Bucephala in his honor, though the details are difficult to verify. What matters is the symbolic weight of the story. A conqueror who had crossed continents needed a mount that represented continuity across those journeys. In the soft memory of later tradition, horse and rider became inseparable, one carrying the other through rivers, battle lines, and the endless changing landscape of the East. It is a small humanizing detail, but also a reminder that even the greatest campaigns depend on fragile living things. As the army pressed farther east, Alexander's encounters with unfamiliar peoples became increasingly complex, and the conquest was no longer only about defeating kings. It also involved negotiating with local elites, tribal leaders, and regional administrators who understood the terrain far better than the invaders did. In some places, Alexander confirmed existing rulers, expecting them to govern in his name. In others, he founded new settlements or imposed garrisons to secure the route. This meant that his empire was always provisional, stitched together from alliances, hostages, tribute agreements, and the threat of sudden force. Ancient sources often simplify these arrangements into scenes of submission, but the reality was more delicate and often less dramatic. Local leaders might cooperate for reasons of survival, ambition, or pragmatism. The Macedonian occupation had to adapt to geography, language, and custom. In a sense, Alexander was not only conquering lands, he was learning how to live inside a web of older political traditions that his sword could shake, but not erase. The world he inherited from conquest was too large to govern by force alone. That difficulty can be seen especially clearly in the campaign through Bactria and Sogdiana, where resistance was fierce and geography itself seemed to defend the defenders. These regions, with their mountains, rivers, and fortress settlements, created a different kind of war from the open field battles of Greece or Persia. Here, mobility and patience mattered as much as shock and charge. Alexander's forces had to deal with raids, ambushes, and strongholds perched in difficult places. The famous story of the Sogdian Rock, a fortress said to have seemed impossible to take, illustrates the blend of daring and psychological pressure that characterized these operations. According to tradition, Alexander offered safety and reward to those who would descend from its heights, and some surrendered when they believed the king's men could reach them by miraculous means. The exact details are uncertain, as ancient historians tend to dramatize the episode, but the underlying point is clear. Warfare in these lands required imagination. It was not enough to defeat an army in a single clash. One had to persuade, isolate, outlast, and sometimes simply wait. In these eastern campaigns, Alexander also appears in the sources as increasingly interested in establishing cities and settlements, many of them bearing his name. These foundations served practical military purposes, but they also carried a symbolic message. A city could anchor a route, house veterans, and project Greek or Macedonian influence into a newly controlled region. Yet such foundations were not empty gestures. They needed roads, wells, markets, and local cooperation to survive. Some developed into lasting urban centers, others remained more modest or vanished from the historical record. The name Alexandria itself became a kind of traveling emblem, marking places where conquest had been translated into settlement. In the quiet logic of empire, a city meant more than stone walls. It meant the attempt to stabilize movement, to turn an army's path into a permanent feature of the land. And because so many of these communities were placed at strategic points, they show Alexander thinking not only like a battlefield commander, but like a designer of networks, aware that power must eventually become geography if it is to endure. The Indian campaign introduced yet another layer of complexity. because it brought Alexander into landscapes and societies far beyond the older Persian core. By the time he reached the Hydaspes and faced King Porus, the army had been campaigning for years, and the strain on men and animals was immense. The crossing of the river, often described as one of the most impressive maneuvers of his career, required deception, timing, and patience. Rain, swollen currents, and enemy observation made the task dangerous. After the battle, Alexander is said to have treated Porus with a measure of respect, asking how he wished to be treated and receiving the famous reply, "Like a king." Whether the words are exactly historical remains uncertain, but the scene captures a recurring pattern in Alexander's legend: defeat followed by dignity. In the humid air of the Indian subcontinent, with elephants, rivers, and unfamiliar tactics, the Macedonians found themselves in a world that could not be reduced to the earlier maps of conquest. Even victory there felt different, less clean, more costly, and perhaps more uncertain in its meaning. Another often overlooked aspect of Alexander's later years is the emotional fatigue that may have settled over the army. Ancient writers preserve moments of refusal and mutiny, especially when the soldiers finally declined to march farther east. This was not mere disobedience, as it is sometimes painted, but the natural breaking point of men who had followed their king across immense distances. They had fought in cold and heat, crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers, and watched comrades fall. The army's refusal at the Hyphasis River marked a turning point, because even Alexander's charisma could not extend indefinitely against exhaustion and homesickness. The silence of that moment may be more powerful than any speech. One can imagine campfires burning low, armor set aside, horses stamping in the darkness, and men speaking quietly about return. Alexander is said to have withdrawn after some days of anger and grief, though the exact sequence is debated. Whatever happened, the episode reveals a limit that no empire can escape. There comes a point when the human body and spirit resist expansion. Great ambition, however brilliant, must eventually meet fatigue. Even so, Alexander did not return as an ordinary conqueror would have. His march back was itself a series of trials, including the dangerous passage through the Gedrosian desert, one of the harshest episodes in the whole narrative. Ancient sources describe a landscape of suffocating heat, scarce water, and relentless suffering, where the army lost many men and animals. Scholars still debate how much of the disaster resulted from route choice, whether. At this stage of Alexander's life, the pace of his campaigns had already changed the world around him, but the personal story behind the conquest still often comes back to one striking detail. He was said to have kept a keen eye on the natural world, especially animals, horses, and the rhythms of movement across land. Some ancient writers describe him as unusually attentive to the breeding and training of horses, not simply because he loved speed, but because he understood what cavalry meant in practical terms. A strong horse could decide whether an army arrived intact, whether a messenger survived a difficult road, whether a king appeared effortless in motion or weighed down by delay. In this sense, Alexander's relationship with cavalry was not merely romantic. It was logistical, strategic, and deeply physical. The horse known as Bucephalus became almost an extension of his public identity, and yet the larger lesson is that Alexander's power depended on constant human and animal cooperation, on feed, rest, water, and disciplined handling. Behind the bright stories of charge and triumph lay the quieter reality of a traveling war machine that had to be cared for every single day. And that same practical intelligence seems to appear in the way he handled cities after conquest. Rather than simply destroying what stood before him, he often founded or renamed settlements, especially in areas he had secured for his own network of control. The most famous of these was Alexandria in Egypt, but there were many others, scattered like careful markers across the vast distance of his route. These foundations were not only monuments to personal glory. They also served as administrative anchors, helping a Macedonian king hold territory far larger than a traditional Greek kingdom. A new city could house veterans, store grain, manage trade, and symbolize a new order all at once. To imagine one of these foundations is to picture dust rising around fresh walls, surveyors measuring ground under hot sky, laborers moving stone, and officials speaking in several languages at once. Even now, historians sometimes debate the exact nature of some Alexandrias, because later traditions often blurred memory, geography, and royal legend together. Still, the pattern is clear enough. Alexander's empire was built not only by battlefield victories, but by the patient invention of places meant to outlast him. That desire for permanence may help explain why he was drawn so strongly to the ancient prestige of Asia. In many of the stories that survive, he is presented not just as a conqueror, but as a figure eager to place himself inside older royal traditions. He encountered lands long associated with great imperial houses, especially the Persians, whose kings had ruled with ceremony, distance, and a sense of cosmic order. Alexander did not simply defeat this world, he absorbed parts of its language of power. He adopted dress, court customs, and titles in ways that made some of his Macedonian companions deeply uneasy. To them, these changes could seem like the soft beginning of foreign rule over themselves. To Alexander, however, they may have represented a way of governing a far more diverse empire. The truth is probably mixed. Part ambition, part political calculation, part fascination with grandeur. His court became a place where Greek and Persian expectations met, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes productively, and always under the pressure of a man who seemed determined to make himself larger than any one tradition. Still, the closer one looks at his reign, the more one sees how unstable that grandeur could be. Alexander was never simply admired without tension. His relationship with his own officers grew increasingly strained as the years went on, especially when the army reached farther from home, and the soldiers felt the weight of distance, fatigue, and uncertainty. The men who had once followed him with enthusiasm were no longer the same youthful companions who had crossed the Hellespont. They had endured extreme climates, long marches, and the emotional exhaustion of endless campaigning. Some ancient sources preserve scenes of argument, resentment, and quiet resistance. One can almost imagine the atmosphere in the royal tent, lamps glowing low, dust settling on cloaks, voices controlled but tense, a map spread out under the fingers of tired commanders. Alexander's achievements depended on loyalty, yet his style of leadership increasingly demanded that loyalty be tested by obedience. This tension is one reason his story feels so human. A brilliant leader, yes, but also a ruler whose success made the ordinary bonds around him harder to sustain. This is perhaps nowhere more visible than in the famous march through the Gedrosian desert, one of the bleakest episodes in his career. Ancient authors describe a terrible crossing through harsh, arid terrain, where water was scarce and the heat could break both body and will. The exact scale of the suffering is difficult to reconstruct, since the sources are colored by moralizing and dramatic storytelling, but there is no doubt that the journey was punishing. The army moved through a landscape of stone, sand, and relentless light, with little cover and uncertain supplies. Animals faltered, men collapsed. The most basic elements of survival became precious. Some traditions say that Alexander refused water when it was offered to him in a helmet because his troops had none to spare. Whether the detail is fully accurate or not, it fits the image later writers wanted to preserve. A king who endured hardship alongside his men, or at least wanted to be seen enduring it. The desert itself seems almost like a character in the story, stripping away decoration and leaving only exhaustion, thirst, and endurance. Yet even in such severe conditions, the machinery of empire kept moving in the background. Messengers still carried orders. Scribes still recorded information. Supplies, when they arrived, had to be distributed with care. Alexander's campaigns depended on communication across immense distances, And this is one of the less glamorous but most astonishing parts of his rule. His world had no telephones, no instant signals, no reliable safety net of modern infrastructure. A decision made at one edge of the empire might take days or weeks to reach another. So command meant patience, memory, and a willingness to trust intermediaries. It also meant that misunderstanding could become dangerous very quickly. A false report, a delayed messenger, a river swollen by rain, a bridge destroyed by weather or sabotage, each small obstacle might alter the course of a campaign. In this sense, the empire was not held together by force alone, but by fragile chains of information stretching over mountains, deserts, and rivers. The silence between those messages may have been as important as the words themselves. As Alexander moved deeper into Asia, he also encountered forms of kingship that were embedded in ritual and ceremony in ways unfamiliar to many Macedonians. He could be adaptable, but adaptation was never simple. At times he embraced local customs to strengthen legitimacy. At other moments, he seemed to provoke controversy by insisting on honors that others found excessive. The practice later called proskyneses, involving gestures of reverence before a ruler, became especially sensitive. For some in his circle, such customs belonged to gods, not men. For others, they were signs of rightful hierarchy. Alexander's court thus became a place where politics and symbolism intertwined so tightly that even a bow or a silence could carry heavy meaning. Historians continue to debate how far he personally intended divine status, whether his ambitions grew toward the language of godhood or whether later generations amplified his image in order to explain his extraordinary success. Either way, the atmosphere around him encouraged myth. It is easy to see how an ordinary king, moving through conquered lands with a gleaming armor and a polished reputation, could gradually become more than a man in the eyes of the world. And yet the human cost remained stubbornly present. Alexander's army was not made of symbols, but of tired bodies. Many soldiers had families waiting far behind them, voices they had not heard in years, fields they had not harvested, children growing older in their absence. The farther they marched, the more the promise of home became a kind of memory at the edge of sleep. That tension helped shape events at the Hyphasis River, where the army eventually refused to go farther east. Ancient accounts portray Alexander as unwilling to accept the limit, but also forced to confront it. For perhaps the first time in his unstoppable career, the will of the soldiers held firm. They had reached a boundary not of geography alone, but of endurance. The river stood as a quiet but powerful answer to empire. Beyond it lay more uncertainty, more distance, more risk. The army's refusal did not erase Alexander's achievements, but it did remind him that command, however vast, still rested on the consent of exhausted men. That moment carries a particular stillness in the historical imagination, like the deep breath an army takes before turning back. Afterward, Alexander's attention seems to have shifted more visibly toward consolidation, administration, and the management of his legacy. He could still act with urgency, but the shape of his project had changed. He was no longer simply racing outward. He was trying to hold together what he had already taken. This is where the complexity of his reign becomes especially interesting to historians. Was he building a fused imperial order, one that blended Macedonian, Greek, Persian, and local elites into something new? Or was he improvising responses to immediate problems without a fully coherent long-term plan? The sources do not settle the question, and perhaps they never can. What can be said is that the empire he left behind was already deeply mixed in culture and administration. Officials, soldiers, artisans, interpreters, and courtiers all moved through a space where boundaries had become more flexible, even as power remained concentrated at the top. In the calm after conquest, the empire began to look less like a single victory and more like a living, changing environment, one that could not be reduced to the memory of battles alone. In the final months and years of his life, this environment was increasingly shadowed by rumors. By the later years of his campaigns, Alexander had become deeply attached to the practice of gathering knowledge as carefully as he gathered territory. He did not only march with soldiers and engineers, he also sent for maps, local guides, craftsmen, physicians, and men who could explain the shape of a river, the habits of a people, or the customs of a distant court. In this way, his conquests became something like a moving archive. The empire he was building was still fragile and often improvised, yet around him there was already an atmosphere of inquiry, as if the world itself had become larger and more legible through his passage across it. Some ancient writers suggest that he was especially fascinated by geography, by the names of places, by the courses of mountain chains and waterways, and by the idea that no frontier was truly the end of the known world. Even if the details are sometimes softened by legend, the broader picture is clear enough. Alexander's campaigns were not only military events, but also enormous moments of observation, when Greek and Macedonian eyes met unfamiliar climates, crops, and coastlines. It is easy to imagine the hush of an evening camp, the murmur of interpreters, the low scratching of reeds on parchment, and the sense that every new region carried both danger and discovery. This curiosity extended to the edges of the Persian world and beyond, where Alexander repeatedly encountered cities that were old long before his army arrived. In some places, he was impressed by the solidity of walls, the order of local administration, or the wealth stored in granaries and treasuries. He often kept the administrative machinery in place, at least for a time, because conquest was easier to hold when it could borrow from what had already been established. That practical habit is one reason his empire could expand so quickly. He understood, perhaps more instinctively than many conquerors, that ruling a place meant more than taking it by force. It also meant learning how it breathed day to day. Taxes had to be collected, roads maintained, supplies counted, and officials trusted just enough to make the system function. For all the drama that surrounds his name, there was in Alexander's rule a constant, almost quiet dependence on bureaucracy. The splendor of his court was supported by the ordinary labor of scribes and messengers, men whose names usually vanish from history, though their work helped hold together the world he was trying to make. As he moved farther east, the cultural mixture around him grew more complicated. Soldiers from Macedonia, Greece, Thrace, and other regions found themselves living among Persians, Bactrians, Sogdians, and many others whose languages and dress were unfamiliar. Over time, this produced not harmony exactly, but a kind of forced coexistence that changed everyone involved. Alexander himself encouraged certain forms of fusion, sometimes through policy and sometimes through symbolic gestures. He adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony, wore clothing that marked him as a ruler of a broader, more imperial world, and surrounded himself with signs of authority that went beyond the old Macedonian style. To some of his companions, this may have seemed like adaptation. To others, it must have felt unsettling, even extravagant. Ancient sources disagree about how sincere these choices were. Some describe a king genuinely trying to unite different peoples under one dominion. Others see vanity or political calculation or the slow effect of absolute power. The truth may lie somewhere in between. What is certain is that Alexander's reign began to blur boundaries that once seemed firm, and the blur itself became part of his legacy. Among the most famous of his later actions was the sequence of marriages and alliances that linked him more closely to noble families of the conquered East. The best known of these was his marriage to Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, whose presence in Alexander's life carried both personal and political weight. The ancient accounts do not agree on everything about their relationship, and like many stories of the ancient world, it reaches us through layered retellings rather than direct testimony. Still, the marriage seems to have been intended as more than private romance. It symbolized a union between conqueror and conquered region, between Macedonian kingship and local elite networks. Later, at the mass weddings at Susa, Alexander also encouraged many of his officers to marry Persian noblewomen, creating a ceremonial web of affiliation meant to bind the empire together. The scene, as described by ancient authors, feels almost dreamlike. The formal garments, the music, the astonishment of soldiers who had spent years in war now being asked to participate in dynastic pageantry. Whether this policy had lasting success is another matter. Many of those marriages did not endure beyond Alexander's lifetime. Yet in the moment, they represented his attempt to shape a future in which conquest would be followed by connection. That future, however, was never secure because Alexander's empire depended heavily on his personal presence. He was not merely a ruler in the abstract. He was the moving center of the whole enterprise, the man around whom ambitions, loyalties, and fears revolved. This made his death especially catastrophic. There was no fully prepared successor who could instantly take over the immense territories he had acquired. There were heirs in name, claimants in blood, and powerful generals, but no universally accepted solution. As a result, the world he had assembled began to break apart almost as soon as he was gone. His companions, later known as the Diadochi or successors, fought one another in a series of conflicts that reshaped the Mediterranean and Near East. The wars that followed were long, exhausting, and often brutal. In a way, they revealed the paradox at the heart of Alexander's achievement. He had created a vast and astonishing political structure, but he had done so quickly and so personally that the structure could scarcely survive him. The empire fragmented not because it was insignificant, but because it had been held together by an extraordinary human force that no institution could yet replace. Even so, the fragmentation did not erase his influence. On the contrary, it spread it. The realms that emerged after his death were often ruled by men who had served under him, learned from him, or defined themselves against him. In Egypt, the Ptolemies built a dynasty that would endure for centuries, while in the eastern reaches of his conquests, Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kingdoms carried aspects of Hellenic culture into new and surprising settings. Greek became a language of administration and learning across broad areas of the ancient world. Cities founded or refounded under Alexander and his successors remained centers of trade, scholarship, and cultural exchange. Statues, coins, inscriptions, and architectural styles traveled with merchants and settlers. The result was not a simple Greek conquest of everything else, but a much more complicated mingling, one in which local traditions persisted and adapted while new forms arrived and took root. The quiet, enduring consequence of Alexander's career was not only that he defeated great armies, it was that he helped open channels through which people, objects, and ideas could circulate on a continental scale. There is also the matter of his legendary aura, which began to form almost immediately after his death. Alexander became a character in stories that grew larger with each retelling. He was said to have visited the edges of the world, descended into the sea in a glass vessel, flown among the clouds, or sought the waters of immortality. These tales belong more to the long history of imagination than to firm biography, yet they reveal something important about how later cultures understood him. Alexander was not remembered merely as a king of Macedon. He became a type of human being at the edge of possibility, brave, reckless, ambitious, brilliant, and ultimately unable to escape mortality. Medieval traditions in many lands, from the Islamic world to Europe and beyond, reshaped him into a figure of wisdom, warning, or wonder. His image survived because it could be adapted so easily. He could be admired as a world conqueror, criticized as a destroyer, or transformed into a seeker of hidden knowledge. In that sense, his historical life ended, but his symbolic life continued with unusual force. Modern scholars still debate many aspects of his career, and the uncertainty itself is part of the story. The ancient sources, while rich, were written long after the events they describe, and they often reflect the biases, literary styles, and political assumptions of their authors. Some sources emphasize Alexander's genius and charisma. Others dwell on his temper, his drinking, or his descent into arrogance. Some present him as a civilizing force, while others see in him the violence common to all conquest. Historians today often try to separate what is plausible from what is embellished, but the task is never simple. The surviving evidence invites caution. Even the basic details of certain episodes can be hard to pin down with confidence. That ambiguity does not weaken the subject. In a way, it makes him more human. Alexander exists for us at the intersection of fact and interpretation, where history often becomes most interesting. The uncertainty around him reminds us how difficult it is to recover a single, stable truth from the ancient world, especially for a man who was already becoming a legend in his own lifetime. Another quiet aspect of his legacy is the emotional language that surrounds him. Ancient writers often describe him in extremes, as if ordinary terms could not contain him. He is alternately heroic, tragic, reckless, and almost superhuman. Yet beneath these grand descriptions, there was a man who slept in tents, endured rain and heat, relied on trusted companions, and grew older before his time. The pressures of command, the constant movement, the strain of wounds, and perhaps the psychological weight of endless expectation must all have affected him. Some modern scholars even suggest that his behavior in later years may have been shaped by trauma, exhaustion, or a heightened sense of isolation. We cannot diagnose him from across the centuries, of course, but it is reasonable to imagine. By the later years of Alexander's life, the scale of his world had become almost impossible to picture in one glance. He had marched from Macedon to Egypt, from the Levant to Mesopotamia, and into the deep eastern reaches of the old Persian Empire, so that his campaigns were no longer just military movements, but a kind of moving map of the known world. The logistics alone were astonishing. Armies needed grain, animals, weapons, shoes, water skins, and replacements for the constant wear of campaigning. Roads that were once simply routes between cities became arteries carrying men, news, and tribute. Alexander's conquests were not sustained by brilliance alone, but by an enormous administrative effort that followed behind the dust of the cavalry. In this sense, his empire was never only a battlefield achievement. It was also a system of supply, record-keeping, and hurried adaptation, held together by people whose names history rarely preserved. And in the background of all this movement was the quiet reality that every successful campaign created more distance, more exhaustion, and more fragile lines of control. As his rule expanded, Alexander increasingly relied on local elites and existing structures of power rather than replacing everything with Macedonian officials. This was a practical choice, and perhaps an unavoidable one. The Persian Empire had already developed a sophisticated network of satrapies, tax systems, and provincial administration, and Alexander often preserved parts of that machinery while placing his own men at the top. In some regions, he kept local governors in place, while in others he appointed trusted companions or military officers. The result was a hybrid administration, part Macedonian and part Persian, though never perfectly stable. Such arrangements could produce resentment, especially among Macedonians who disliked the influence of former Persian officials, but they also helped Alexander govern territories that stretched far beyond the cultural world in which he had been raised. It is one of the quiet ironies of his reign that a conqueror famous for sweeping change was often forced to depend on continuity, on the old rhythms of bureaucracy and regional authority, because empire itself could not function otherwise. Another side of Alexander's later reign was his growing tendency to found cities, or to refashion existing settlements into centers of Greek and Macedonian presence. These foundations were more than trophies. They were practical anchors, places where veterans could settle, trade could develop, and imperial power could take on a visible shape. The most famous of all, Alexandria in Egypt, would become one of the great cities of the ancient world, but it was only the most famous member of a larger pattern. Across his routes of conquest, towns were established or renamed, their streets planned, their populations mixed, their harbours or fortifications strengthened. For some people, these cities brought opportunity, new markets, and a wider cultural horizon. For others, they represented displacement and control. Yet, whatever their immediate effect, they outlived the man who founded them. The city became one of Alexander's most enduring weapons, a way of turning military conquest into lasting geography, and of making his name feel almost like a feature of the landscape itself. In the final years of his life, Alexander also began to adopt more openly the symbols and customs of Persian kingship. This included ceremonial dress and court practices that many of his Macedonian followers found unsettling or even humiliating. To Alexander, such changes may have reflected a broader vision of rule over a mixed empire, one in which he was not simply the leader of Macedonians but the sovereign of Asia. To his companions, who had followed him from the forests and mountains of the Balkans, these habits could look like alien excess or dangerous distance. The famous controversy over proskyneses, a form of homage involving bowing or kneeling, revealed how sensitive the issue had become. Was Alexander trying to bridge cultures, or was he placing himself above ordinary human custom? The historical record does not give one simple answer. It shows instead a ruler negotiating a delicate line between adaptation and self-mythology, between the practical demands of empire and the personal grandeur that seemed increasingly to surround him. At the same time, Alexander's personal life became more entangled with dynastic strategy. He had married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, a union that likely combined affection, politics, and the hope of securing loyalty in a newly conquered region. Later, he also took additional wives, including Statira, a daughter of Darius III, and possibly Parasates, daughter of another Persian nobleman. These marriages were not private gestures in the modern sense. They were instruments of political integration, attempts to knit together Macedonian and Persian aristocracies through family ties. Yet they also created tension because they unsettled existing expectations about rank, inheritance, and the place of women at court. Roxana remained especially important, and after Alexander's death, the question of succession would become entangled with her unborn child. Here, once again, empire and intimacy were inseparable. Marriage was not only a personal bond, but a political event, and in Alexander's world it could alter the future of kingdoms. There is also the quiet, often overlooked matter of how much Alexander's empire depended on women in the royal and noble sphere, even though the surviving sources focus so heavily on men and war. Women like Olympias, his mother, wielded influence through correspondence, patronage, family alliances, and court intrigue. Persian royal women, too, retained importance after conquest, though their roles are harder to reconstruct from the surviving records. Queens, mothers, and noble women could help legitimize claims, preserve wealth, and act as vital intermediaries in elite networks. Yet ancient historians, shaped by their own conventions, often left these figures in the shadows or treated them as secondary to the great deeds of kings. Modern scholarship has tried to recover more of this hidden dimension, reminding us that empires are never built by soldiers alone. They are also sustained in households, marriages, palaces, and the intricate social webs that connect power to family. In that quieter realm, influence often moved softly, but it could still alter the course of history. Alexander's final campaign, especially the expedition toward the Persian Gulf and beyond, reveals both his relentless ambition and the growing uncertainty around his strategic goals. He planned great naval projects, explored the possibility of linking the rivers and seas of his empire, and considered further movements into Arabia. Some historians have treated these plans as evidence of boundless imperial imagination. Others have wondered whether they reflected a ruler increasingly driven by momentum, unable to stop moving once conquest had become his habitual state. The evidence is fragmentary, and the ancient narratives sometimes dramatize his visions in ways that blur practicality and legend. Still, it is clear that he was looking beyond the immediate horizon of Mesopotamia. He wanted more roots, more reach, more connection between regions that had once seemed separate. That desire gave his reign its extraordinary dynamism, but it also contributed to the exhaustion and instability that came with endless expansion. And then, in Babylon, the atmosphere around Alexander's court became heavier, more charged, as if the pace of conquest had finally slowed enough for anxiety to be felt. Babylon itself was a city of vast age, with temple complexes, canals, and administrative traditions older than Macedon by centuries. To enter, it was to step into a place where empire had many previous lives. Alexander spent time there making plans, receiving embassies, and organizing his next movements, but the city would become the stage for his final illness. The ancient sources describe a sudden decline after a banquet, followed by fever and weakness over several days. Some accounts suggest he may have developed a natural illness, perhaps worsened by exhaustion or infection. Others, later and more sensational, speculate about poisoning. Modern historians usually lean toward disease rather than conspiracy, though certainty remains impossible. What matters most is the human scale of the scene. The king who had crossed continents now confined to a bed, surrounded by anxious companions, breathing in the warm, heavy air of Babylon, while his empire waited uneasily outside the chamber. The final days of Alexander's life have become one of the most famous and mourned episodes in ancient history, partly because the sources preserve them in a mixture of realism and drama. He reportedly lost the ability to speak clearly, yet continued to acknowledge his generals and bodyguards. When asked to whom he left his kingdom, he is said to have replied, "To the strongest," though even this famous phrase may be a later reconstruction, a neat summary of the chaos he unleashed by dying without a clear adult heir. Whether he truly spoke those words or not, the effect of his death was the same. The empire's future became a question without an immediate answer. His body was treated with extraordinary care, and the story of its eventual transport became itself a symbol of posthumous power. A ruler who had sought to command the world could no longer command his own succession. In that tension between grandeur and fragility, the ancient imagination found one of its most enduring images. After Alexander died, the enormous structure he had assembled began almost at once to fragment. His generals, known later as the Diadochi or successors, competed for territory, legitimacy, and symbolic inheritance. Some claimed to govern on behalf of his son, others on behalf of his half-brother, and still others sought outright control of provinces for themselves. The wars that followed were fierce, prolonged, and complicated, as the empire split into competing kingdoms that still carried his legacy in language, administration, and royal style. In a way, this fragmentation proves how extraordinary Alexander's achievement had been. He had built not a settled empire with a stable constitutional center, but a personal dominion held together by force, prestige, and his own living authority. Once that authority vanished, the structure began to unravel, yet even in collapse, his creation left deep patterns behind. The Hellenistic world that emerged from the ruins of his empire would shape art, science, trade, and politics for centuries. And so the final fact is perhaps the most enduring one, because it is not about A,